Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, and body liberation. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding. Cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beefing. Now I'm ready for the world, trying to sink my teeth in.
Hey there, welcome to episode 142 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Caleb Luna, a writer and fat activist who writes a lot about gender and body politics. We talked about how gender identity intersects with fatness, how to tolerate the desire for weight loss, why representation matters, and so much more. It's a really, really good conversation, and I can't wait to share it with you in just a few minutes. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Laura, who writes, "Hi, Christy. You use the term thin privilege a lot on your podcast, and while I understand how fortunate I am to be in a place where fat shaming isn't something I have to endure on a daily basis, I still carry a lot of guilt whenever this term is used. I'm finally weight restored after 12 years of anorexia, and I'm dealing with an extreme amount of body animosity, but I'm still considered thin by society standards. Can you please go into a little more detail about why you use this term, what it truly means, and how I can participate without feeling like a hypocrite? Thank you so much for everything you do." So thanks, Laura, for that. That's a really great question. And before I answer, I'm just going to give my usual disclaimer, which may not totally apply here anyway, but just in case, these answers are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, this is a great question, and it's something a lot of people ask me and something I've thought a lot about myself as someone who does this work, helping people make peace with food while living in a thin body myself. The first thing to remember, though, is that people of all sizes experience body shame. So you don't need to feel guilty for having trouble accepting your body just because you're on the smaller end of the size spectrum, because that is very, very common. Fat phobia affects all of us, and it instills a fear of fat whether or not we're actually living in larger bodies. So I talked about this in a little more depth with Sarah Harry and with Lisa Dubril in their episodes. That's episode 139 and episode 140. So I'll link to those in the show notes so that you can check those out. But just to say, it's very normal and very common in our society, unfortunately, for people of all sizes to have internalized body shame and internalized fat phobia. And that's one of the reasons why size discrimination is such a problem, because it does affect everyone. So that being said, living in this world in a smaller body versus a larger one definitely does have its differences, and weight stigma is very, very real. So this is where thin privilege really comes in. So thin privilege is not something that bars you from body shame or internalized fat phobia, right? You can have thin privilege and experience internalized fat phobia like you're talking about. But thin privilege does protect you from most forms of external fat phobia and also from weight-based discrimination. And discrimination can take place at the systemic and institutional levels in the form of discriminatory hiring practices for jobs. People in larger bodies are less likely to get hired for jobs. And also lack of access to space, like not having theater seats built for you, not having airplane seats that can accommodate you, all these space issues where our society is designed with a very narrow idea of how much space a body's going to take up. And a lot of people can't fit into that narrow idea. And discrimination can also take place at the individual level in the forms of bullying and shaming and causing a lot of emotional distress for people in larger bodies. And I want to say that people in smaller bodies can also experience interpersonal body shaming. It's not just limited to people in larger bodies. And a lot of people on the podcast have described this when they've said, I was shamed for my size at a young age, and that's what really started me on this fight against my body. And looking back at the pictures, I can see that I wasn't even objectively in a fat body at the time, but the people around me were shaming me for my size because of their own issues, basically. And so that definitely can happen too for people in smaller bodies. But the preponderance, the vast majority of that kind of interpersonal stigma does happen towards people in larger bodies and not so much towards people in smaller bodies. And the systemic oppression of people in larger bodies is really something exclusively experienced by people in larger bodies. So weight-based discrimination has really real consequences. It has not only the emotional distress piece, right? Not only does it make people feel really bad about themselves because it's barring certain people from physical spaces and jobs, and it limits their access to resources and their ability to earn money and support themselves. So it actually has like physical, tangible ramifications, financial ramifications, but it also contributes to a constant state of stress, which is ultimately harmful for people's physical health as well. So you've got physical, interpersonal, emotional, systemic, and mental distress that's all happening because of this weight-based discrimination. So people who live in marginalized bodies, whether they're marginalized because of their size or their race or their gender or a combination of different oppressions, because that often happens, people live at the intersection of multiple oppressed identities. People don't just have to endure discrimination. They also have to deal with the long-term effects of the discrimination in the form of ongoing physical stress. And, that takes the form of an ongoing fight or flight adrenaline response, which is the response that our bodies have to a perceived threat, whether that's emotional or mental or physical. It's the exact same response. Our bodies respond in the exact same way, which is they release cortisol, a stress hormone, and they put us on high alert. And what happens if we're on high alert all the time, right? If we're in this constant state of stress, well, our bodies really weren't meant to sustain that stress response over a long period of time. And having it really kicked into overdrive has some real physical consequences, including elevated blood pressure, increased risk of heart attack, insulin resistance, and many other poor health outcomes. And ironically, these health outcomes are the ones that are often associated with being in a larger body. These are the things that get blamed, or body size gets blamed for these health outcomes. So not only are there very real consequences to living with weight-based discrimination, but there's also the issue of victim blaming, where, instead of blaming the health markers on the stress or discrimination itself that's causing them, our society blames them on the individual, which only serves to act as yet another stressor in people's lives. And so it's a vicious cycle, right? It piles discrimination on top of discrimination. And it negatively affects people in larger bodies in a way that people with thin privilege don't experience. So this is why it's so important to me to acknowledge our thin privilege. And, in activist spaces, that's a common thing of naming and acknowledging privilege, because privilege is so often not talked about, not owned up to or discussed. And that's part of what keeps oppressive systems in place, is not naming or talking about privilege. So it's really important to name and acknowledge thin privilege. And as someone in a thin body, I have to acknowledge that I don't have these added physical and emotional consequences of having a body size that society stigmatizes. And I also don't constantly have to fight the systems in our world that are made to exclude people in larger bodies. And that is a huge burden that I just don't have to grapple with on a daily basis. And it's a privilege not to have to grapple with that, right? Just like being white is another privileged identity that I hold, and I don't have to deal with the effects of racism on a daily basis. And so in terms of how people with thin privilege or even other privileged identities can participate in size acceptance activism, I would say that it's just very similar to how men can participate in feminism with their male privilege, or how white folks can participate in anti-racism movements when we have white privilege, or how people with really any sort of privilege can participate in social justice work. It's about being an ally and doing what you can to further the movement and using your privilege for good, while also knowing your role, right? Knowing your place and not using your privilege to speak over more marginalized people who are really the focus of the movement. So first, I would say as a tip for this, to quiet down and listen. Don't make it all about you. Learn as much as you can about the movement and about people's experiences and oppressed identities. And if there's information that confuses you or makes you feel defensive, try to sit with it and process it on your own, or perhaps with the help of a therapist and some internet research. There's lots of great stuff written about size acceptance and racial equality and all this other stuff, right, online. So it's a great time for being able to research this stuff. But try to sit with it and process it instead of becoming combative or defensive or demanding that people in marginalized identities expend the emotional labor educating you, because it is tremendous emotional labor for people to have to explain their oppression to someone who doesn't experience their oppression. The next thing I would say is to trust people in marginalized bodies, make space for them, allow their voices to be heard, believe them when they say that they had a certain experience of oppression, believe them, support them, uplift their message, because oftentimes people in marginalized identities will have their stories questioned, or have people say, people with more privilege say, oh, that can't be how it was. Oh, you experienced experienced size discrimination from that person, I'm sure they didn't mean it like that. Or I'm sure that wasn't what that doctor meant when he said, we're going to have to put you on a diet or whatever, right? People are constantly having their experiences of oppression questioned and minimized. And so as allies to this movement, if we can make space for people's experiences and believe them and not question or minimize their message, but support them and ask how we can help, that's a huge step. And I would say too, as people with thin privilege, we have a unique role as allies to be able to talk to other people with thin privilege, right? Other friends and family in thin bodies who might not be able to hear this message from someone in a larger body or might have too much internalized fat phobia to be able to listen to it coming from someone larger. We have a place in being able to talk to people who can't quite see it yet, who are people with thin privilege really ensconced in fat phobia. And so we can talk to our thin friends and family. We can point them to the work of people in larger bodies when they're ready. We can spread their messages to those people in our lives that wouldn't otherwise listen to people, in larger bodies, right? Because arguments for fat acceptance and health at every size are already pretty radical. And so it's hard to hear a radical message no matter what. It shouldn't be radical, but it really is in our culture because we live in diet culture. But it's an unfortunate truth that people in larger bodies might not be trusted as easily when it comes to spreading information about health because of fat phobia and discrimination, right? Fat phobia and discrimination create these conditions where people in larger bodies talking about these issues might not be listened to in certain circles as easily as someone with thin privilege. So we can get into certain circles that maybe larger bodied folks can't. And conversely, there are some folks who might not want to listen to someone with thin privilege talk about health at every size and accepting your body and intuitive eating and recovering from an eating disorder. Some folks who are in larger bodies and feel marginalized might want to learn from other folks in larger bodies and feel safer that way. And that's okay too. So for those of us with thin privilege, I think we have to acknowledge we're not for everyone. And I think that's true of all of us, right? No one is for everyone. So knowing that maybe you're not going to be able to resonate with some people in larger bodies who really want to learn from people who look like them or people who experience the world really like them, that's fine. But as folks with thin privilege and thin allies to this movement, we have a role. We can reach people who need to hear this message coming from someone in a less marginalized identity. As shitty as that is the way the world is right now. And so that's an important role we can play. So you can use your thin privilege to really speak the truth that some people are refusing to listen to, that many people refuse to listen to, and direct them to other amazing people doing this work and uplift the messages of people in larger bodies doing this work. And then the last message I want to say in terms of being part of a fat acceptance movement or the body liberation movement is remembering that this movement wasn't made for the people who look like me and you, for the people who look like me and the person who asked the question. It absolutely helped to heal me, and it helped many other people I know in thin bodies to heal their own relationships with their bodies and with food, right? It's super, super important work, but it wasn't made for us. It grew out of the fat liberation movement that was created by and for fat people. And it just so happens that their messages are incredibly important and beautiful and really needed for everyone in this fat-phobic society. Everyone needs to hear the messages of fat liberation. But it's important to just remember that those of us in thin bodies can't center our experience in this movement, but instead to center the experience of the people who need this movement the most, the people in the most marginalized bodies. So that's what I try to do with this podcast, and you can absolutely find your own way to participate in the movement that makes use of your strengths and your abilities while also centering the people who don't have the privileges that you have. So using your privilege for good and passing the mic as much as possible to the people who don't have the privileges you have. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that gives a little more context to the idea of thin privilege. And thanks so much, Laura, for asking the question. If you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode of the podcast, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want a whole library of answers from me to help you master intuitive eating and make peace with food, plus the chance to ask me any question you want about your relationship with food and your body, you can join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. You'll not only get an exclusive monthly Q&A podcast that I do for participants, which answers all of your questions, specific nuts and bolts questions about intuitive eating, but you'll also get to be a part of a private community, which helps you connect with hundreds of other fellow course participants who are doing this work, who are on the intuitive eating eating journey and really working to make peace with food in their bodies. Plus, I'm in there answering questions in the Facebook group, providing guidance along with my wonderful staff. So you really get a huge amount of community support and individual attention and all of your specific questions answered in this course. If you're ready to become an intuitive eater and leave diet culture behind, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Caleb Luna. Tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
It's interesting. I'm actually doing a lot of kind of retrospectives now as I've started therapy, and we haven't quite touched on my relationship to food specifically, but we have touched on the way that my body was interacted with as a fat body by my family and how that has impacted me long term. And so I'm, doing a lot of retrospective, kind of thinking back to my relationship to food and helping understand it more. I just spent 10 days in Texas with my family of origin for the holiday. And that was so interesting to see how in my family, food is very much comfort. And I felt like they were always snacking at least, which felt really complicated for a few different reasons. But yeah, food's always around. It's a source of joy and comfort and something that we really look forward to. And I think especially because I'm the youngest of my family, and my childhood was pretty disruptive. And so I think that growing up, because my parents and my older siblings had such chaotic lives, I didn't really feel like there was a lot of space for me to do anything and really make waves. And I'm really beginning to see how I turn to food as a source of comfort in that situation, and how food has really been something that, it's a source of comfort. And it feels complicated to talk about that as a fat person, which is also ironic because I feel like I know so many thin people who experience the same. I think that food is kind of almost universally a source of comfort for a lot of people, but it becomes this the meaning becomes bigger and implicated whenever we're fat.
Right. Totally. Yeah, I think that's it. You're very right. It is a universal thing that food is a source of comfort, and it's almost evolutionary. It has to be. It has to bring us joy. It has to bring us pleasure. It has to be something that we really crave or gravitate towards to keep us seeking it out. And that's kind of innate within us.
Right.
And then it's complicated when it's, there's an emotional situation where you don't really have a lot of resources, you don't really have a lot of outlets or coping mechanisms, and food becomes an easy one to turn to. And I think regardless of body size, that happens for so many people.
Yeah.
And I think with diet culture, and especially living in a fat body, but I think diet culture and the fat phobia that permeates our culture is so universal that whenever someone is turning to food for comfort, there's often this backlash, this fear of oh my God, my child is doing this, or, someone in your life sort of being don't do that, that's the way you get fat, or that's the way you get sick, or that's going to lead to basically down this road to perdition.
Right.
And so then there's this deprivation implied there, you're not allowed to do the thing that's bringing you comfort, and it just sort of exacerbates the whole situation.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's probably also where a lot of moralizing around food comes in, right? I've been good, so I can eat this, or I'm being bad, so I can eat this. But
totally.
It's actually just what does your body need right now? And if your body needs sweets to calm down, so be it.
Right. Yeah, there shouldn't have to be a moral value placed on that, but there is, unfortunately, in our society.
Yeah.
Did you find was that your experience with your parents? Was there some shaming going on about your food choices and related to your body size, or how did that play out?
It's interesting. I think probably because of the way I was gendered and how I'm assigned male at birth. And so I think that there was a lot more leeway, whereas I don't recall having my food intake scrutinized necessarily, especially not the way that I see my niece and her food intake being scrutinized. But there was this anxiety around my body size. And I'm beginning to realize how, my dad actually has really disordered eating. And my dad is really the one who made my body the source of anxiety for him that I internalized. And I think it has a lot to do with masculinity and heterosexuality and I've always been a pretty feminine person, and then my fatness is pretty soft, so it feminizes my body. And I think that I don't know how much he is aware of this, but like, I think there were some threats to his masculinity in that, whereas, and like, he's fat. My mom is like a very small fat person, but like very much like considers herself fat. And so like fatness was always sort of present in our family. Like we were always sort of a fat family, but I was like always the fattest. It was always a problem for me to be my size. I mean, there were some moments where, I had an injury as a child that they blamed sort of on my size. And so they went to, as part of my treatment, they took me to see a nutritionist, and I didn't really follow the nutritionist plan.
How old were you at the time?
I was about 12 or 13.
It's a hard age.
Yeah. And I think in retrospect, I was just like so afraid I think because there was so much anxiety around my body size, I was afraid to even like touch anything that could validate that. It's like a legitimate source of concern.
It's interesting. Did you sort of police yourself around certain foods then?
I didn't. I was like so adamant to not make like simple changes of like switching to Diet Coke or whatever. And like these small things that were recommended by the nutritionists. And I think that there was just part of it was there was no like fat positive or health at every size framework, that it was, you need to do this in order to lose weight because you're inherently healthy. And it was never these questions of like, what do you actually like? And it was always trying to force these uniform ideas of like healthy eating and healthy body size and all that stuff on me.
Right. And equating body size with health too, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's interesting that your family all were fat and identified as fat, and yet it sounds like there was a lot of internalized fat phobia there, where it was like your way of being fat was not okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's so much internalized fat phobia in my family, and externalized even. Yeah, it's something I feel like my mom and I are like kind of getting to these questions, like we're starting to have these conversations around intergenerational trauma, and especially like mild childhood trauma and how it's made long-term impacts on me, which I feel very lucky for. I don't feel like many mothers and many parents, many people are as self-reflective as my mother and are willing to like make these proactive changes, even if she wasn't necessarily in the space to do that when I was a child. I see her doing that now as like a 60-something-year-old woman, grandmother. And so she is very inspirational for me and aspirational for me in those ways. But we started to talk a lot about her childhood, and she was like, my father always, for some reason, I was always the fat one, even though like I look back at pictures and I was just a kid. And so she already had this understanding of herself growing up as a fat person, even if she wasn't.
Wow. So there's like this intergenerational transmission of fat phobia too, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And yeah, how beautiful that you're able to have that relationship with her now and do some of the work that wasn't possible when you were younger.
Oh, yeah.
To get through process through some of the trauma.
Yeah, I feel very lucky.
That's amazing. What about with your dad? Have you been able to talk with him about the fat phobia at all?
No, he is a complicated person. And this is the other thing, is that he's an alcoholic, and he's been sober for like 20 years, which is great for him. But I feel like his recovery has not evolved necessarily past like stopping drinking. So it's been less of a conversation with him. But this idea of how children of alcoholics and addicts, or, addiction, the way we understand it now, is like genetic. And there is a conversation about how children of alcoholics and addicts like might replace whatever addiction with food. And I don't know how much I believe that and how much I'm like willing to accept that narrative as part of my own. I mean, it's definitely it's my father's addiction, and like the addiction of my other family members has definitely like shaped my life and my childhood in a way that, I don't know, maybe there is something there.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think when you think about it as coping skills or coping mechanisms, really, like alcoholism is not necessarily the most skillful means of coping, but it is an effort to cope, with psychological issues. And so there becomes this addictive process to a substance.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with food, like they've done research and it's been shown that it's not possible to be addicted to food in the same way you can be addicted to alcohol or to drugs, like the physiological addiction. But there is like a psychological component of coping that I think is common with those things, where it's like you're reaching for something to cope, whatever that thing is. It's
right.
sort of a substitute. It's not actually getting at the root of the problem. It's just your best effort to like do what you can. And so,
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that can happen with food and with other substances. And it's that same underlying trauma that causes all of it, right? That like you have something you need help with, you need to cope with, and you don't have the tools to do that because no one has modeled that for you or taught you. So you're just doing the best you can with what you have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too, because my brother is like a fairly thin person, and I see him like having a similar relationship to food where he like jokes about, we'll be like, I have to go talk to some food about this, which I think is a line from like maybe 30 Rock or something, but we'll like talk about kind of what we're eating as like coping mechanisms. And so it's interesting to me how this also like, again, translates across body sizes. Whereas like, if I'm eating a sweet, there's going to be a different sort of response to it than if he is.
Right. I think it's really interesting, that idea. And especially that you mentioned 30 Rock, like it makes me think of how the character of Liz is sort of given this like quirky, thing with food where she's always turning to food for comfort. And no one accuses that show of like, quote unquote, glorifying obesity or something, right? It's like,
yeah,
it can be seen because she's a person in a thin body. It can be seen as, oh, this is just her quirky thing, and we can laugh about it. Whereas if it was someone in a larger body doing that, I think there would be a much bigger outcry for many reasons, because putting a central character as someone in a larger body in a show always sort of draws that terrible criticism of like, you're glorifying obesity, like,
right.
But also because, it's considered causal. I think when people are in a larger body and turning to food for comfort, there's this sort of assumption that was not true, that it's like, well, eating that way caused the body size. And in reality, people of all sizes eat that way. People of all sizes use food in various ways to cope. And it doesn't have a direct bearing on their body size, or it's not like the reason for their body size.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that it's also, I think that's a trope that's common in, at least in sitcoms, of like people who like eat sort of large proportions of food and they're like really into eating and all that stuff, but they can only be thin people.
Right. Yeah. And it's sort of considered okay for thin people to do that. But also like how interesting that comes up so much, that the idea of turning to food for comfort is sort of like a comic thing that people can laugh about. And I think kind of speaks to the fact that it is such a universal phenomenon that people do it and also feel ashamed about it. I think part of the reason that it's used as fodder for humor is that there's this diet culture induced shame that we have on turning to food for comfort. And so it's like, oh, I'm so bad. Tee hee hee. I'm doing this, I'm using food in this way, and like, shame on me. But then, it sort of dissipates the shame when you can see a character doing it and laugh about it or something.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like part of my inspiration for starting this podcast when I first did almost 5 years ago was this idea that everybody has a complicated relationship with food, and I wanted to talk to people about it. It didn't have this sort of laser focus that it does now on like size acceptance and why that's so important and helping people recover from disordered relationships with food. That sort of evolved along the way as I saw like how people were relating with food. But I think the original impulse was just like, yeah, we all are kind of fucked up about food. And like, why is that? I wanted to explore that.
Absolutely.
Well, so I'm curious for you, in your experience, how that relationship with food evolved over time, from kind of those early days of using food for comfort in childhood. And then after that experience in adolescence where you were taken to the dietitian and stuff, like how did it evolve from there?
Yeah, I kind of in the early stages of unpacking my relationship to food, actually. And I think that I've always avoided interrogating it because it felt too scary. Luckily, I found fat acceptance and fat activism years ago, and that helped me to kind of alleviate it helped me feel more comfortable with eating And it removed this like compulsion to pathologize my eating habits. And so really like the past few months is when I'm first starting to look at like more honestly, like my relationship to food and how, yeah, learning like skills like moderation, which is a new thing for me.
That's interesting. I think the idea that it makes so much sense why you would want to protect yourself from pathologizing your relationship with food. Like it would be sort of difficult to square body acceptance, fat acceptance with a narrative about your relationship with food that is pathologizing or blaming, right?
Right.
Yeah. So how did that unfold for you, like the journey to fat acceptance?
I feel like I was very severely targeted as a fat child, and I had a lot of trauma around my body size, and not just from like peers and bullies at school, but from my family and mostly my father. And so I think when I found fat acceptance, it was really nice to see people be like, actually, it's okay to be fat, and destigmatize it and be okay also with enjoying food, which was really important. And I think I swear that fat people are like creative geniuses with food. Like having fat friends and seeing the things that fat people come up with is incredible. And I think people are very jealous, and they should be. So it was this interesting, like having this interesting journey of realizing that body size doesn't necessarily correlate with food intake, and also seeing how I have thin friends who do eat a lot and are still thin and don't exercise. And like, you know, we have very similar like lifestyle habits, but knowing thin people who don't have fat bodies, even though our like food intake and lifestyles are similar, I'm like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah, that's like a really good way to give the lie to that narrative that your lifestyle predicts your body size.
Yeah.
When you really observe what other people are doing and you have people that you're close to that you can kind of share food with and just get to know in that way, it's like, oh, right, that doesn't actually have any bearing on this.
Yeah. And I mean, I do like lead a pretty sedentary lifestyle. You know, I do enjoy Netflix and reading and, you know, those things. And it's for different reasons too. I mean, part of it is just like inherently what I enjoy. Some of it is being out in public is really hard when you're fat, and I don't want to like deal with it. And it's easier to like seclude myself sometimes. But I also know lots and lots of thin people who have similar lifestyles. And I've started noticing how like rarely when I go out to eat with a thin friend, like they'll clean their plate and I won't. I think some of that has to do with like the stress of eating in public as a fat person, and like the different loaded implications it will have if like I clean my plate versus if they do.
Yeah. Do you find yourself policing yourself on your food choices when you're out in public more?
I've gotten better at it, but I remember especially like when I had a pretty late start to college, and I started when I was about 26. I transferred from community college to university, and I remember like starting that journey and being angry at myself for eating or like being hungry. And I'd be like, why am I hungry again? Like I just ate, and having to be like, oh wait, actually I ate several hours ago and I've like done a lot of activity since then. But feeling like anytime I was hungry was like inherently gluttonous or something.
Yeah, it's interesting how fat phobia gets internalized in this way of judging hunger. I feel like that's really common experience that I see in my clients that I work with on their relationships with food, and also in my own past history of struggling with food and coming to accept my body and stuff. It was like, I think it's like there's this added layer when you're in a fat body and out in public, I'm sure that makes it extra fraught, and sort of like you're policing yourself and cracking down on yourself even more. But I found when I was dieting and it sort of spiraled into an eating disorder, it was suddenly hunger was this thing to be tamed and wrestled into submission, you know, like it was not okay to be hungry.
Yeah.
That's a really scary thing, you know, to be fighting against your instincts like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's instead of like thinking, or like how I've begun to think about it is like, I am like actually in a relationship with my body, and my body is signaling to me that it needs food, because food is how bodies keep going. You know, it's like literally like energy. And it's not about some overconsumption or anything like that. It's just like, actually, like, this is a living thing that I'm inhabiting, and it needs basic living needs like food and water.
That's so great that you've been able to reframe it like that, because I think that takes a lot of work to get to a place where you're able to destigmatize it and to see it just as basic needs, which it's so sad. Like, that's our birthright. That's how we really all came into this world, like knowing how to relate to food in that way, and it gets ripped away from us through diet culture and through fat phobia. But it's really, really cool to be able to come back to it and to see, like, yeah, at its core, at the fundamental level, food is just energy, and you need energy to survive. And self-care, it's really a form of self-care to eat.
Yeah. And I think that also this targeting of fat people as like over consuming food, or when it does have this like basic function, and like, do you like not think that these bodies deserve to be alive? Like,
right.
You don't think that these bodies like actually deserve basic, not just human, but like living organism 101. Like, you water your plants. Everything needs nutrients. And the way the discourse around like fat people eating has devolved, I'm just like, you actually like don't think that we deserve to be a living organism.
Yeah. That's such a good point. Like, it's this desire to erase fat bodies that is at the core of that, because it's like the basic fundamental care and feeding of bodies doesn't change no matter what size you are. It doesn't matter what size body you're in. You need those basic things to keep going. And so, yeah, denying that. And I think it's also so insidious that it just makes you question your instincts, your connection to knowing what you really need and being able to care for yourself. Because when you've been told, well, you're fat, so it means that you're always over consuming. I think that's the implication with all the fat phobia that gets internalized, is like anything you eat, if you're in a fat body, means that you're eating too much. And so you can't really trust like what is enough, what is too much, what do I really want, gets really lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm realizing how disassociated I've always been from my body, because it's felt so scary to like actually ask those questions down to the basic, like, how does the food that I eat actually make me feel? And realizing that like I was eating a lot of foods that made me feel bad. Like, I'm pretty lactose intolerant, and I was just like, eat lots and lots of ice cream and sour cream and just like cheeses. And I was just, and I'd be like, oh, it's fine. It never occurred to me that like, if I don't eat these foods, like my body's actually going to feel better. And it took me such a long time to like make that connection, because the discourse around my eating was always, everything is always inherently too much. And so any sort of restriction, even if it was for my own well-being outside of like my body size and more about like how I felt, it felt too scary to engage with.
Yeah, totally. I think that's like a really important thing to highlight too, that's a place a lot of people are at when they start the journey towards like reconnecting with their body and healing their relationship with food, is that there's this phase where it's too scary and it feels too much like deprivation and diet culture to go into any level of restricting what you eat, even if it's like your body telling you. It's not an outside restriction. It's like a self-knowledge thing where you're like, oh, maybe I'm not going to have this ice cream because I feel bad when I eat it, or maybe I'm going to have a lactose-free one or whatever,
Yeah.
But that can feel like exactly the same as the trauma of deprivation, of other kinds of food deprivation. It takes a while, I think, to process through that, to get to a place where you can be like, I can have literally anything I want. It's all on the table. It's all available to me. There are no restrictions. And what do I really want? Like, from that place of knowing it's truly all available to me. What do I feel like eating?
Right. Yeah. Like, I don't say that I can't eat dairy, or I mean, I do, but like, I've had a friend who like reframed it as like, I can eat whatever I want, but am I going to like how it makes me feel after? Eating dairy isn't going to kill me. It's just going to make me like really uncomfortable for a long time. And I like being comfortable. So I'm not going to do that. Or I'll engage with it like really strategically. And I don't eat ice cream, but like sometimes I'll eat cheese on my burger or something,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like knowing kind of what your body can tolerate and knowing it as something that you get to choose to do, and it's for your comfort. It's not for anyone else's like satisfaction or to follow the rules or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah. That's a huge thing to get to that place.
Yeah, it took a minute, and I was like very lucky to be surrounded with lots and lots of fat community who helped me through it.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
How did you discover that community? Like, how did you first find your way to fat acceptance?
I had my like oldest and best friend, her and I are both fat and like fat identified. And we met in like 10th grade PE class, which is like irony of ironies for these two fat kids to like find each other. And she loves to read, and she's very knowledge seeking also. And she checked out Fat So by Marilyn Wan at the library. And I just kind of, I think through that, just kind of like tangentially became aware of like fat acceptance. And I never even really like had to go to, I mean, now I'm part of like Facebook groups and stuff. Tumblr did a lot too, because I was able to find so many fat positive blogs and like see fat people doing different things with their bodies, seeing fat people in different contexts who were like having active social and sexual and romantic lives, and who who were like dressing really fashionable and like were really like popular and loved, and all these things that I just like never felt like I had access to as a fat person. And so I think that was really, really, really game changing for me. And also like, ironically, it was a lot of like white people, mostly like women and assigned female at birth people. And so there was like this aspect of like, this is like fat positive, but it's still in this like, it still feels a little bit out of reach for me. Definitely like helped me get the ball rolling to like see at least some sort of reflection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it moved the needle a little bit.
Yeah. And so now I try really hard. So because I know the power of that, I know how affirming it feels to see yourself represented in a fat person looking really confident and sexy. And I try really hard to like model that really intentionally for people, because as a thank you for the people who modeled it for me.
That's beautiful. And yeah, that's such an important thing too, to see yourself represented.
Yeah.
Because that's not given to you. I mean, if you're a fat person in this society, you're not seeing a lot of representations except for very select ways of being represented in TV and movies and fashion and stuff like that. But it sort of like blows the lid off that to see communities where people are proudly fat and also having these rich, diverse experiences and lives.
Absolutely. I mean, part of my fat history and my fat experience is feeling a lot of rejection, like romantically and sexually. And it wasn't until I was like literally 29 where I was like, oh, wait, like some people aren't settling when they sleep with me. Like for some people, this is what they want. The fact that it took me so long to even be like, oh, I'm not like a consolation prize because I'm fat was intense, but it's true. Like there are people who, for different reasons, are like really attracted to me. And there are people who aren't. And like, that's whatever. Like, I don't want to be, that's just not where I'm putting my energy these days, is like convincing people.
Ugh, yeah. It's not a battle worth fighting.
No, it's bad sex.
Right. Ugh, I know. Convincing someone to be attracted to you, like it's just, yeah, no good. But yeah, that's a really powerful experience too, to feel like you actually are not the consolation prize, that you're valued and wanted and desired for who you are.
Yeah.
That must have been a journey as well.
Oh, it definitely was. And it's not over either. I'm still like I'm still working on like unlearning and healing those parts of me. But it's, I think that I've come a long way.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I've read some of what you've written about discrimination against fat bodies and bodies of color in the queer male community, and like how that experience showed up for you. And I'm curious to hear a little more about that, like what you went through to start to feel like you could find a place where you were desired and you could express your own desire as well and have it be reciprocated.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because I feel like that is still very new to me as well. And it has come from being here at Berkeley, ironically enough, I had a really long road to graduate school. And there was actually a moment like last semester where I realized that like I was always coming at people from the defense, like that I always felt like I was having to convince people about like my intelligence, my worth, my value. And realizing, and I just started my second year and I was like having these seminars with all these people. And I was like, they seem interested in me in this way that like I had never experienced before. And I was like, oh, I realizing that like I no longer had to like convince people that I had value because it had become self-evident through this journey, and that, you know, my colleagues inherently trusted my value just by me being here, which also feels really complicated because it's not something that everybody has access to, that everybody, you know, I'm very privileged to be in these spaces, as difficult as they are. It's still a huge privilege to be here and to feel like affirmed and validated.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a much more accepting community than what you came from.
Yeah, and it's really hard to say like if it's the chicken or the egg or whatever, like how my relationship to myself and like seeing my own self-worth and value outside of like other people's opinions of me impacted that, or like because just so much changed at once. And so I don't know, like, had I had the confidence in undergrad that I do now, if things would have changed. But I also like couldn't have had the confidence without these experiences that I couldn't have had without confidence, and so on and so forth. So it's like this very like unfortunate kind of self-repeating cycle almost. Many things had to come to fruition.
Right. Well, yeah, it's like they say you teach people how to treat you, which is a complicated thing because I think, you know, a lot of us are just, I mean, we're all just thrown into a situation growing up and we sort of get what we get from our families of origin.
Yeah.
And then we sort of learn how we exist in that dynamic and maybe sort of end up recreating or finding situations that recreate that dynamic going forward because that's what we know, because that's what feels familiar and comfortable. And it's not like our fault, really. It just happens. But then I think to sort of heal from that and get to a place where you can say, oh, I recognize this dynamic. This is a pattern from my past that I don't want to repeat anymore. And how can I demand or ask people to treat me differently and show up in a way in this situation that I will be doing something differently than I've done before.
Yeah.
That's sort of a privileged position too, I think, to get to a place where you can have that sort of self-awareness and decide to do something differently.
Yeah.
I definitely went through that myself with my own healing from trauma and childhood stuff, like getting to a place of going to therapy and being like, oh, I'm now aware of these dynamics and I'm now seeing ways that I could change that and ways that I could show up differently, and having someone somewhat neutrally point out to me like, oh, you're doing this thing right here, and have to have the reactions to that I had, like, oh my God, what do you mean? You know, get defensive or get angry, but then be like, oh, maybe you're right, you know, and maybe there's another way.
Yeah. Oh my God. I had such this intense experience. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
Oh, no, go ahead.
I'm a Leo and I feel very like self-conscious about, because I do have the tendency to interrupt people.
Me too. Oh my God. I'm a Leo also. And I feel like I apparently have a Cancer rising. So it makes me sort of more like of a quiet Leo, but I definitely have that like drive, you know?
Yeah. I'm a Pisces rising. So we both have that water.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah, I had this experience where this person in my class last semester, I remember seeing them on the first day and just like immediately like resenting them for no reason. And I was just like, I am so attracted to you. Like there's like no way you can reciprocate and I already hate you for it. And I remember just like being very mean to them or just like, not mean, but I was just like very cold. And then I was sitting there after a few weeks of class and I was like, I've never actually like given this person a reason to be nice to me. What if I like approach them differently and, you know, I'm just friendly? And so I did. And then they were really friendly back. And, you know, by the end of the semester, I ended up asking them out on a date and now we've gone out a couple of times.
Oh my God. That's amazing.
Yeah. So it's like having been in a place where I had access to therapy and like had been able to do some healing and digging and like develop some skills to sort of check those things in myself has also helped a lot.
Oh yeah, that's huge. That's awesome that you could be like, because I think it takes a real degree of like not only self-awareness, but sort of non-judgmental awareness to be able to say like, oh, hey, I'm actually being sort of mean to this person and I can see why they would be would be reciprocating that or just not being friendly to me because I'm not giving them a reason to. It's like you're sort of observing yourself from the outside instead of being so in it that you're like defensive about it and can't even, see that.
Right. And like also knowing that I developed these self-preservation techniques for like a very good reason. And, they did align with my experience for a very long time. But like, it's a matter of like the things that we learned as children aren't necessarily useful anymore as we change and grow and our situations change. And so that was like one coping mechanism that I had to like check myself on and be like, this actually no longer serves me.
Right. Yeah. Which is such a self-compassionate approach.
Yeah.
And that's so important with this stuff. I think like, because I think there's like this tendency, and I went through this too in my own therapy of being like, oh God, I'm so terrible that I do this. Like I have this coping mechanism or I didn't even see it as a coping mechanism at the time. I just saw it as like this neurotic thing that I did, but then getting to the place where you can be like, actually, this was a coping mechanism and it was there for a very good reason. We wouldn't do anything without a reason.
Right.
Is a way to start to have more compassion for yourself.
Yeah.
That's where things can really change. You can't shame yourself into doing things differently. You can't shame yourself into having a better relationship with yourself. That's
right.
The polar opposite of what you need, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm curious to hear more about your relationship between gender and fatness, because you wrote this amazing article for The Body Is Not an Apology that I just love called The Gender Nonconformity of My Fatness. And you spoke a little bit about like your gender identity as a kid and how that was sort of shamed or not accepted. But how did you get to a place where you were able to sort of understand your gender identity and accept that? And then how has fatness informed that and gotten you to a place where, like you said in the article, you're sort of at a place of gender apathy, like not even feeling sort of beyond or like done with it or something. So how did that all unfold?
Yeah. Well, I think that fatness is gendered in the ways that depending on like where on the body it is and what kind of fatness it is, specifically if it's like a hard or a soft fat, and you can kind of like, there's these like differences between like a football player who's fat and they're just kind of like big and solid. You can tell like still have muscles versus like me, who's just this kind of like fleshy, curvy creature who's like very soft and very, lived a life of luxury, if you will. But I think it's actually just like realizing that from a very young age, my body people were always sort of confused about my body and my gender. I feel like I was in like maybe the 6th or 7th grade. The first time I remember somebody being like, oh, that's a boy. And like being confused about my body because I had little like boobs or whatever. And growing up having back in the days of landlines when people would call like my house and I'd answer and they would mistake me for like my mother or her daughter. And I would like get misgendered at drive-thrus a lot. And so there was always this sort of like confusion about my body. And I think like also trying to like have sexual and romantic encounters and seeing how my body didn't match up to the idea of men that men were seeking. And then when I would have sex, the ways that my lovers would feminize my body in this interesting way, and that they would there was like always a kind of preconceived notion about our gender, about our roles and like what we would do based on very outdated gender stuff where like I was gendered as the feminine. And that was like part of what they liked about it too. And so just kind of realizing that this body that I have like does not actually comfortably fit into these categories that we have allowed ourselves that are like insufficient. But like, and it's beyond an idea of like identity, like at the like physiological level or like the material level of a fat body, like our bodies frequently transcend what male and female bodies are supposed to look like. And yeah, I feel like kind of excommunicated from cisgenders. Like if it was something that I wanted, I'm not sure that I could have it. It doesn't necessarily feel like a choice. And I also feel very fine with that.
Mm-hmm. Was that always the case, or did you go through a journey to sort of get to be okay with that?
Yeah, I think for a long time I was like, I never really like identified as masculine. There was like a time, there were several years when I was like identifying as cis and understanding that I wasn't like your normative cis person, but I was like, especially cis man. But I was like, I'm trying like redefining what manhood can be and all this stuff. And I was like really in this space of like recuperating maleness and manhood. And then trying to like be in queer male community for so long unsuccessfully. I was like, I eventually got to this point where like this is like actually not, they don't want me. Like this is, so I'm not trying to be there anymore. I'm not trying to like force myself into this category that it just doesn't want me and I don't want it.
Yeah, so it was sort of like trying too many times and feeling like you were banging your head against a wall.
Yeah.
Finally being like, nope, I'm not going to do that anymore. Does that feel painful at all, or does it feel like you're at a place of acceptance with that?
It definitely has been painful and frustrating. But I think the more I ask myself what I want, the more I understand that like what I don't want is to have to like explain my body to people and like convince them and like beg them. And the more I can think about what I want, the less I'm concerned about what other people think. And the less I'm concerned about pathologizing them too. Because I'm like, you have something going on that I don't know about and that has nothing to do with me and it's fine. And we're just like not compatible in this way. And that's fine. And it doesn't mean we have to be mean to each other. And it doesn't mean that we like the other person doesn't have any value. It just means that like our bodies aren't going to operate this way. And that's chill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a place of more compassion too, like not feeling angry about it, but just recognizing it's just an incompatibility.
Yeah.
I'm also curious because you wrote a great piece about the experience of being larger fat versus the experience of being smaller fat and how that's different. And I'm curious to talk about that because we haven't really delved into that so much on the podcast. And, you know, I think there are a lot of people who have been on the show who are in a smaller fat body or who haven't really talked about the specific nuances of sizes. And you made a really good point that like thin privilege is a spectrum and that people experience different amounts of thin privilege, even in fat bodies or culturally constructed as fat. There's still some privilege at the smaller end of the spectrum and how life looks different and the experience of fatness is different at different sizes. So would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I talk in that article a little bit about like how I moved from Austin, where I felt like I was always the fattest person in the room. And I probably was. Or if I wasn't, it was like very rare. And so like I had this understanding of myself that I was like literally at the end of the fat spectrum and that like I was the fattest thing possible, which is not true. But it was after moving to the Bay, going to No Lose, which is a queer fat activist sort of conference. And I went there in 2015, I think. And, you know, they had such a variety of people in fat bodies and like lots of people fatter than me. And then coming to the Bay and befriending people who were fatter than me and and for the first time really like being like, even though I kind of, for example, if I weren't able to fit in a clothes at ASOS, like I can still do a lot of things that bigger fat people can't. I still have a lot of privileges that bigger fat people don't. And so like that kind of reframe was really impactful for me to think about, oh, even though like I've always had this understanding of myself, it's like actually false. And knowing that like I had such a frustrating relationship with people who were smaller than me, who like wanted to assume that our fat experiences were similar. Or even like my understanding that our fat experiences were similar and then realizing that like they're actually very different. Because I wanted them to be similar. And as much as I wanted us to like have that in common, there was still like so many barriers and differences across like race and gender and
right. Yeah, that the intersections of fatness with those other things informs how you're going to move through the world differently or experience the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm curious with that experience, what you would say, because I hear from a lot of people, like clients that I work with or people that are in like groups I'm part of and stuff that say the experience of living in a fat body or a super fat body in this culture is so pathologizing, it's so difficult to move through the world in this way that wanting to lose weight, or like it feels inevitable or impossible not to want to lose weight. Like it sort of feels like the only solution or the only way out is to try to change the size of your body. And for you, as someone who's come to a place of fat acceptance and given up that effort of changing your body, like what helped you get there? And what would you say to someone who's in that place of feeling like, well, you know, I can't fit in airplane seats, or I can't shop at the stores I want to shop at, or whatever, and my body is not accepted in this world, and therefore it really feels like I have to change it?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm like beyond that place necessarily, and that I don't have those thoughts. And I think that it's a completely understandable response, because it's difficult, and I'm not going to pretend that it's not. And I'm not going to pretend that maybe because I can tolerate it for now that everybody else should also. But for me, the biggest sort of revelations that I've had around this are like, first of all, that my body is not the problem, that like actually the way that my body is responding to is the problem. And it's difficult because I have no control over how people respond to my body, but that like my body is not the problem as much as it can be the source or the cause of so much frustration and pain. One of my fat heroes, Mark Aguilar, has this piece called These Are the Axes. And I think the first one is bodies are inherently valid. And I also think about who's profiting off of me hating my body and wanting to change it, and like what work I'm doing for that, realizing that people who profit off of my body, specifically like my brown body, like my colonized body, like this is the work of like me trying to lose weight and me trying to fit into these beauty standards that are pretty transparently white supremacist, that I can never fit into anyway, even if I was thin. It's making rich people richer at the expense of my own personal like happiness and mental health. It's doing the work of the colonizer to try to change myself and erase myself and minimize myself. And I don't want to, that's a hard boundary for me, is to perpetuate colonialism through my daily actions any more than I have to. And that is one way that I don't have to. And so thinking about who's actually benefiting from me doing this, and who is actually like reaping these rewards. Those answers are going to be different for everybody. And I don't want to fault or blame people for choosing to lose weight, because I get it. It's a real response to trauma.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a really beautiful way to say it, because it is, there are all these forces acting upon us and acting upon people of size to change their bodies. And like the forces are the problem, right? The society we live in, the fat phobia, the institutionalized fat phobia, not to mention racism, sexism, transphobia, all that stuff too, right? Like all of that is the problem. And yet, as individuals, we're up against this giant tidal wave that's pushing us in a direction. So if we go in that direction, it's not our fault. Like it's the tidal wave was sending us there, and to resist it is a big effort. It takes a lot of work to do that.
Yeah, it's a big ask.
Yeah, it's a huge ask. Yeah, I mean, I think having your values, and it sounds like you're very clear about your values and knowing it's a hard boundary that you don't want to participate in that system. And so recognizing that you're not going to do something that's going to perpetuate colonialism and perpetuate fat phobia is in line with your values. So maybe that's something that people can consider if they're in that place, is what are your values? Like, what do you want to participate in? What do you want to be a part of or not be a part of?
Absolutely.
And yeah, I mean, I think it's really lovely that you have such compassion too for the idea that you're in this place now and you're able to withstand it now, but that doesn't mean that it's always going to be easy or that it's always going to be possible. You know, I hope it is. That's my wish for you and for everyone, is that we can create a society where it doesn't have to be so hard, where it's not a tidal wave pushing people in that direction, you know, where we can somehow over time, all of us working together, change that norm, change that dynamic so that people aren't forced to change themselves and put themselves through physical and mental trauma to do something that isn't actually possible anyway, long-term or sustainable. But yeah, until that happens. And I mean, my most optimistic days, I'm like, it's 10 years away, but realistically, like it's happening, But like, no, probably not in my lifetime if I'm realistic. But, trying to have that optimism, I think is helpful too. Because I think it takes a lot of sustained work by a lot of people to try to move the needle and to try to change society in that direction.
Yes, I am also optimistic about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to hear about your PhD project and what you're doing, because I know it's related to all this stuff, to bodies and how people's bodies show up in the world. So would love to hear about that.
Yeah. So it's kind of changed a bit. And right now I'm more interested in, I have a lot of interest, but I'm interested in the way that I feel like discursively through culturally, we have these ways of valuing like girth and heft and grandness and glutton even. For example, if you say like, this cake is really rich, there's like this excess or there's this like abundance of flavor, right? And like in that instance, that abundance is a valued quality. Or even like being rich and having a lot of money and resources at your disposal is valued as well. But when we get to like actual bodies, then it becomes less, not only is it not valued, but it's actively discouraged and punished. And so sort of the disconnect there between how the words that we use around these qualities don't align with bodies and why and for what reason. And I have my own like hunches and guesses, but I think like, generally like we are very obsessed with with categorizing people and bodies based on not just on size, but according to race and gender. And it's something that we culturally like feel is inevitable and necessary. And I just don't believe that it is. And even having words that describe bodily variations is like, it feels to me to be accepting these disconnects and these, how we're turning each other on each other, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. So like putting people into categories is a way of like disconnecting from each other.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense.
And we see this on so many different embodiments from like race and gender and sexuality and ability and size and so on and so forth.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. I think this is a very necessary, worthwhile topic to be addressing, and especially in the world that we're in today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Are you planning on, is this like a thesis project or what sort of format is it taking?
Well, I'm in my second year of my program, and it's about a 5 to 6 year program. So it's still in the very early stages, but hopefully, it'll be a dissertation, ideally, which will turn into a book. But that...
Can't wait. Pre-ordering a copy now.
Thank you. But that is... I don't know if I have any way of telling like what kind of time frame is going to happen now.
Right.
But I appreciate the excitement.
Very excited. Yes, I'll update people when it's closer to the time. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I have been such a fan of your work and really, really happy to talk with you. This has been such a great conversation. So thank you for sharing everything you did.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Caleb Luna for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. Sharing on one of the Apple platforms helps bring us higher in the rankings, in the podcast rankings, so that more people can discover us and so that we can continue to drown out the pro-diet messages and keep rising up in the health category. So just go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts, click on the 3 dots at the right-hand corner of your screen, and then click on share episode to share it. You can also tell your friends and family to subscribe, because more subscribers also helps bring us up. Honestly, the algorithm for Apple Podcasts is a little opaque. Nobody knows exactly what goes into it, but it's some combination of reviews, ratings, sharing, and subscriptions. And sharing and subscriptions seem to be the biggest things. So you can also leave us a nice rating and review. That always helps us out too. And that also just makes my day when I see the nice ways that the podcast is helping people. If you're looking for some practical practical tips to get started on your own anti-diet journey, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. Then to get the full show notes for this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, go to christyharrison.com/142. That's christyharrison.com/142. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, become an intuitive eater, and leave diet culture behind in the dust, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Food Psych is edited and engineered by Podcast Fast Track. Our community manager and content development associate is Ashley Saruya, and our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble. The music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put you there in that perfect position now? Bullies want your food, and you ain't really beat.